This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host G. Sampath. Since the inauguration of President Donald Trump, the administration's crackdown on undocumented migrants has led to more than 3,500 arrests. And in a related development, Colombia narrowly avoided a trade war with the United States when it turned back American military planes bringing back deported Colombian migrants. And when we come to India, the Indian government has repeatedly said now that on the immigration issue, it will do quote unquote the right thing by the US. And now there are also reports of Indian families in the US rushing to have preterm cesarean sections before Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship kicks in on the 20th of February. And there is also apprehension in the Indian community about changes to the H-1B visa regime, of which Indians are currently one of the largest, if not the largest, beneficiaries. So there are lots of questions around these issues which are floating in the air. For instance, how are undocumented immigrants, especially Indians, affected by Trump's moves on the immigration regime? Are Trump's plans for large scale detention and deportation likely to take off? And in case they do, what could be the likely economic fallout and socio political impact of such a move? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Dr. Neeraj Kaushal, professor at the School of Social Work at Columbia University, New York. Dr. Kaushal, welcome to In Focus and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, Dr. Kaushal, to start with, I just wanted to have your views on this entire phenomenon we've been reading about in the media of Indian families rushing to preterm C-sections before February 20th, which is the day when President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship actually takes effect. So, can you give us a little bit about the background and history of this entire citizenship provision, and whether the Indian community in the U.S., in particular, stands to be, more affected by it, given the high number of H-1B visa workers who are, in the waiting list for a green card and so on.
Let me start by saying that something that's obvious is that birthright citizenship is not a global norm. It is a rarity. For instance, India, China, Japan, United Kingdom, many countries, Western countries, they don't have birthright citizenship. They don't grant citizenship by birth. Uh, Hence, the question is, how did the US begin to provide birthright citizenship? The history of this issue goes back to the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which was ratified in the 19th century, 1868. The purpose of the amendment was to make amends to what has come to be known as the Dred Scott decision. Now, Dred Scott was an black African person. He was born into slavery. He sued the federal government uh, because he at that time lived in Illinois, which was a free state, and he wanted himself, his wife, and his two daughters to be freed. The Supreme Court at that time, in a 7-2 judgment, ruled that African descendants were not US citizens, and therefore Mr. Scott had no grounds for suing the government. This, even at that time, created a lot of outrage in the US society, uh, but nothing could be done at that time. And then at the end of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was ratified. It was as if to make amends to the Dred Scott decision. Now, the question is that if there is already a 14th Amendment, why are there these various interpretation of these? Some people are trying, including President Trump, uh, create another interpretation of it. Um, the reason is that the first sentence of this amendment has what is called a citizenship clause, which has words to this effect: all persons born or naturalized in the United States are subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States. So these five words, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, have been interpreted by some people who do not want birthright citizenship as to say that undocumented people in the US are not under the jurisdiction of the United States. So that's where this whole issue comes. Now the issue is that, as you know, that a court in Seattle has issued a temporary restraining order to halt the President Trump's executive order. So the issue is what happens now. If it comes to the Supreme Court, how is the Supreme Court going to interpret it? Trump has the advantage because the Supreme Court is very conservative, but that's where it ends. Supreme Court judges, including the current lot, are constitutionalists. By that, I mean that they go by the original interpretation of the Constitution, so there is a good chance that they will strike it down as well. Yeah, so the question is, what is Trump going to do if this original order, the first order, is struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional? Well, we can only guess, and his first strategy, his first term provides a lot of ways to guess what he's going to do. So in the first term, in his very first week in office in 2017, uh, if you remember, President Trump announced what came to be known as the Muslim ban. These were travel restrictions on citizens of seven countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, to begin with. The order was dragged in courts, blocked by judges, denounced at times even by Republicans. So over several months, Trump administration brought out modified versions of the initial ban. So I believe there were three different orders that went through various stages, various courts. And I can only guess that, if the current order is dismissed by the courts, the administration is going to bring new orders uh, with some modified language to push it forward. But does that mean that this will happen? Well, courts take a very long time in India and in the United States as well. So you can actually see this happening for the next 2 or 3 years. 2 years are crucial. After that, it's possible that Trump get tired and he wouldn't like to be seen as getting defeated by the courts again and again.
So if the courts are going to take a year or 2 years or 3 years in this interim period before it is settled, would these orders be in effect, or would they be like in suspension? Suspension, will they be stayed?
These orders would be stayed. So the order is already stayed. But it is going to create a lot of nervousness in people, as you're saying that, many people are going for cesarean sections. But nonetheless, is going to create a lot of concern. And that's the objective of the order, to create that shock and awe that this is what he promised and this is what he's going to push. So if it goes through the courts, then it's going to be a very long drawn process. At the end, whether something will happen, whether we'll see a very diluted version of the original, which is what happens in case of the Muslim ban, that a very diluted version 3 was actually uh, held by the Supreme Court uh, about 2 years later, a year and 8 months later, I believe.
Right. So at one level, of course, there is this. There are two sides where, on the one side, you have this progressive dilution or modification of this executive order happening, and on the other side, you have the Supreme Court, looking into this entire thing. But assuming the court doesn't approve of it, is there a chance that he could make another constitutional amendment to change this entire provision itself rather than relying on executive orders? And if that were the case, like what kind of numbers would he require, and does he have it?
He doesn't have, that's the thing. If this were to go through a constitutional amendment through the Congress, he doesn't have the numbers. A constitutional amendment requires uh, getting two-third majority from the Senate, as well as 75% of the states, actually state governments, their legislatures going through this. That too is a long drawn process, and he doesn't have the numbers for that.
Okay, okay. So coming to the human side of this entire phenomenon, I mean, all these. I mean, I don't know if there are other communities as well who are sort of rushing to have preterm babies before the February 20th deadline. Is this something specific to the Indian community? I mean, would it be fair to say that Indians are more worried and affected by this entire birthright citizenship being eliminated than say compared to other communities, because they are like disproportionately having to wait much longer because of this country cap for green cards and all that?
I mean, I don't think so. You know, a lot of the people who are going to be affected by this are the undocumented, and Mexicans are the largest number, although their numbers have fallen in recent years, but they are about 46% or so of the undocumented are Mexicans. And so it's really the undocumented who are going to be more vulnerable. So I think this the Indian community going for cesareans, that's more like a distraction. uh, Generally the Indian community that is here, they'll have to just get used to a new sheriff on immigration in the United States. The thing is that they're highly skilled and there is opportunity for them everywhere. So I believe in the long run on Indian immigration, the US would be the loser if they want skilled people. They actually need workers at every level, uh, but they really want skilled people. So uh, I think this is part of a distraction. I haven't seen the numbers, but that would be my gut reaction. And I don't think Indians are more vulnerable than other communities, um, because a lot of there's a large Indian diaspora here, and many of them are, citizens or legal residents. Yeah.
Right. So there is also this development which everybody is talking about, which is the declaration of a national emergency at the border. So, what do you think that was aimed at, and do you think that's going to sort of speed up this entire process of deportations and so on?
As far as I understand, national emergency at the southern border, it basically allows the government to use additional funding and military resources to build enforcement infrastructure at the border. If you remember last time, about 8 years ago, President Trump was not able to get any funds to build the wall, the beautiful wall that he wanted to construct and make Mexico pay for it. He was not given any money for that. So this was kind of a preemptive action for that. And I think the second reason is that ICE, which is involved in local enforcement, if they begin to
ICE
focus
as in
locally.
ICE as an immigration and customs enforcement agency.
Yeah, immigration and customs enforcement agency which is involved in local enforcement, if they bring all their focus on locus and enforcement, they will obviously have less people guarding the border. So this is one of the things where they think that maybe they can have the help of the military at the border. It's not Military is not supposed to be involved in civilian issues. So this is again something I think that treading it very carefully, but they have moved a lot of Marines and Army soldiers to the border. And that could also create a problem in the sense that, military is not supposed to be involved in that. And I think maybe because of that, they wanted to have this national emergency. They're also, ICE is using military base in Colorado to detain immigrants. So this whole thing is primarily to make sure that they have the resources, which I think are very, very limited if you want to undertake a huge deportation drive. It's a very challenging proposition.
Right. So, from what I understand, Dr. Kaushal, you are saying basically that this national emergency is going to enable Trump to draw on military resources so far as immigration enforcement at the border areas are concerned, and he's going to be using ICE to do immigration enforcement in the other parts of the country. Is that the broad strategy?
I think that must, because you see, there's already a lot of, Department of Homeland Security has its people at the border. So the borders are well guarded. Uh, why did they impose national emergency? It is just to make sure that they can have some resources. Whether these things would be challenged, whether the use of military there would be challenged, I think it will be. But it is partly to address those issues. You see, what happened last time when ICE was involved in local enforcement in Trump's first term, overall deportation was very low. So, deportation, United States, in a regular year, in a normal year, they do a lot of deportations, but most of it happens at from the border. So people are captured at the border who don't have documents, and they are sent back. Uh, because in the first term, ICE was largely involved in local enforcement, where they were going into communities where they had to fight with the state governments, or the local, sanctuary cities were not letting uh, ICE to operate in their cities. That they were actually fighting with them, and they lost focus of the border. And as a result, people would be surprised to know that deportation during Trump's first term was less than the deportation, uh, annual deportation that Obama made, and the annual deportation that Biden was able to make. So, it's a lot of, he wants to create a lot of shock and awe, create terror in communities where immigrants live. But the overall impact, even now, the numbers are tiny.
Right. No, Dr. Kushal, now this whole enforcement you've been talking about, there are 13.3 million undocumented migrants in the United States, and going by his rhetoric, I mean, he would want to sort of deport all of them, you know. But do you think, given the what you spoke about the sanctuary cities, and many of these migrants, they own homes, they pay or contribute to the taxation, they are sort of in many ways integrated with the US economy. So how, in what ways do you think the sanctuary cities are going to be are helping them? Are they giving them other kinds of paperwork? Can you talk a little bit about how this dynamic works? Because you mentioned that in his previous term he ran into a lot of hurdles with managing the sanctuary cities, and how they sort of prevented his agenda from coming through.
So let me start with, first, looking at this issue, whether he'll be able to deport 13.3 million undocumented people. He has the will, he has the gall, he wants the rest of the world to see him doing so. The question is, one, does Trump have resources? Second, even if he has the resources, will ICE be able to actually identify the undocumented? And finally, what would be the impact of all this on the United States, on the country? Now, as you said, this is going to be a very inhumane process, but Trump does not pretend to care for that. But it requires enormous resources. American Immigration Council has estimated that the government would have to hire 10 times, at least 10 times the number of ICE staff that it currently has. So it will have to hire between 220,000 to 409,000 new law enforcement agents. And it will
Is this one way
cost,
he could be planning to create jobs? Maybe I don't know. I'm just wondering.
well, you have to train law enforcement agents. Not anybody can get that job. And then the issue is, do they have the resources? The government has huge deficit. One of the things that he's going around doing is, if you saw yesterday's uh, uh, this morning news, that they have given all federal employees the option to leave by September, so they get 8 months salary and they leave. So there is the issue of resources, so reallocation, maybe fire the regular employees and hire law enforcement agents. I don't know. I think it's more like giving people the impression that they're doing it, not necessarily actually doing it, because the numbers, the cost of it would be enormous. It's not just more enforcement agents, it's also how do you create, you'll have to create detention centers, you have to have the domestic transportation facilities. So one estimate I saw that they will have to have flight capacity for deportations about 500 times more than they currently have. So currently, if you deport like 100 people, 200 people to Colombia, and that's okay, but the numbers that we're talking about are huge. And one estimate I saw that had all the costs put together was about 350 billion to 1 trillion. And the difference, you'll see there's a huge difference, but it depends on what is the time frame over which you want to accomplish this. So it's a huge cost. Then, in addition to the cost, is okay, even if you put all these resources, would your enforcement agents be able to identify the undocumented? You know, Evidence is that school raids or workplace raids have very limited impact. Most of the deportation does not happen from there. In fact, ICE's own report actually acknowledges that deportation last time fell because they were engaged in internal immigration enforcement. Now, remember, two
No,
thirds of the
how is it?
undocumented.
How could it be so tough to identify the undocumented? I mean, undocumented should actually stand out, right? They don't have the documents. So how do you say it's difficult to identify the undocumented?
Well, so two-thirds of the undocumented have been living in this country for more than a decade. So they have family members, children, spouses, siblings who are U.S. citizen, legal resident. They have home ownership. It seems like close to 40% actually have their own homes. They have many work in regular jobs where, I mean, almost all of them, they have a large number have social security numbers, so they pay social security taxes, medicaid taxes, and they have regular jobs. Some
No,
of
I'm
them
just
have
I'm just trying
social
to understand. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Kaushal. In India, for instance, I'm just trying to sort of relate to the experience people have in India. Here, if you don't have one Aadhaar card, it's so difficult to get by with anything at all. You won't get Narega wages. You can't file your taxes. You can't do your PAN card. Here, people don't have their basic citizenship documents, and they're able to do all of this. Is the documentation regime very different over there? I mean, is it not essential to have this primary identification to get by?
Social security numbers are required in order to have, for instance, credit card. But there is a parallel banking, maybe small, but informal banking sector that helps the undocumented. And I said a large number of them do have social security numbers, which is the like our Aadhaar card. They may be stolen numbers, maybe number that they acquired before they became undocumented. You see, some people enter the country through the border without documents. A lot of them actually come and overstay their legal residency. So if someone who is an H1B on H1B visa, and uh, the visa term expires, but they have a social security number, so they have access to a lot of services. It is there may be some problems in life, but then there's another very interesting phenomena that is probably only seen in a country like the United States, that there is no single vision on immigration. There are these cities all across the countries which are called sanctuary cities, where they provide a large number of services to the undocumented. So there are cities where New York City is one of those sanctuary cities where they have a New York ID. And the New York ID, I mean, the way they created this ID was that they knew that a lot of the people who would seek New York ID would be actually undocumented. And they wanted to make sure that it does not become a stigma only for the undocumented. They provided all kinds of fancy benefits, like for museums or for restaurants, you get a benefit initially if you had a New York ID. So a lot of people went for New York ID. And the thing was that when they created the ID, all the background information that was collected, which was minimum, but that was destroyed within 6 months. That was the promise, so that people don't track New York ID to undocumented status. There are many states, there are some 20 odd states, if I'm not wrong, where they have driver's license are given to undocumented. There are many states where undocumented children, so children of undocumented people who are also children, they have health insurance. There are some 22 states where undocumented kids have in public schools, they can pay a lower tuition. They can pay tuition equal to what residents of those states pay. So there are many states where which are or cities which are called sanctuary cities that protect their citizens, in their residents, including the undocumented. And that's where the federal enforcement agencies, when they want to go and do local enforcement, the city governments are saying, we don't want to cooperate with you because we are here to provide law and order. And if we are seen as doing immigration enforcement, these people who are undocumented, if there is a law and order problem, they would not like to reach out to us. So it's an interesting thing that probably it's only one of the few countries in the world where there are law enforcement agencies that don't look eye to eye on these matters. And sanctuary cities are one of them. And in 2017 we thought that was the Trump's election was the end of sanctuary cities, but sanctuary cities had grown over time, and they did not back away at that time. In 2017, Trump said he will withhold his funding, federal funding from these cities, and they took him to the courts and they won. So that
So
withholding funding.
all those threats of withdrawing federal grants and so on, this time around, you don't think it's going to sort of make the sanctuary cities change their minds on undocumented migrants?
What I'm saying is that they did not, the funds were not withheld last time. It was rendered unconstitutional by courts. So sanctuary cities got the funds. Now you're right that this is a very different time. Uh, this is, Trump administration has come prepared. They are much more organized than they were last time. They believe in this shock and awe treatment, that people, that their supporters, their voters actually see them acting. Whether they're actually doing very much is, we don't know. We'll see. So far the number deported is not that large, but they are getting the headlines that he can bully, for instance, Colombia to to take their undocumented by slapping tariff duties. And there are other countries. I mean, I think India will take its citizens, China will take its undocumented citizens, so many countries would take them. The issue is, what would be the impact of that on the one first issue is, can you identify them? Yes, you can probably deport another 500,000, which Biden did too, or maybe 1 million. But beyond that, can you go into the communities where people have been living for 10, 20 years, they have their regular life, and actually identify them? if they have a social security number. And that would be a very, very painstaking process. I think it can be done. I mean, if you just think that that's the only thing you want to do. And then the question is that how is that going to affect your economy? Because these undocumented people, they work, provide services, they provide childcare, they provide elderly care, they provide health care, so the lower level healthcare facilities. A lot of undocumented people are engaged in that, and documented are engaged in the farm sector. Uh, there are places like California. About 70-80% of their farm employees are the undocumented. All over the country, immigrants are, very, very large proportion of farm workers are immigrants, because they actually do jobs that US residents are unable or unwilling to do. So that's where that would be the last point. How is this going to impact the US economy?
So
There's
you,
one
you don't think you
study.
don't think if the undocumented workers were forced to leave, uh, it would probably help the natives, so quote unquote, to get those jobs, Native Americans, quote unquote, to get those jobs at a higher wage. That seems to be the logic behind this entire agenda. That you will get your jobs back and you will get it at a higher wage because the immigrants are repressing your wages by working at a cheaper wage. So, do you don't think that logic is going to be borne out at all?
So there are two parts to it. Does immigration lower the wages of native workers? So, and then what happens to the quality and the price of services that immigrants provide? So, as a nurse into the United States, I would impact the wages. If I'm a nurse and I'm working in the United States as an immigrant, I might impact the wages of other nurses in this country. But what about the healthcare services that I provide? So I bring down the cost of those healthcare services. So it's, if you look at a very, very narrow occupation category, you might actually see there's a lot of research on that, and the evidence they find uh, is weak in terms of how it impacts the wages of local workers, American citizens. But theoretically, the argument is sound. So I don't actually, question that, but I actually want you to look beyond that and see how does the immigration provide workers outside the nursing industry. So uh, presence of more doctors, more nurses, how does that impact the quality of the services that, let's say, doctors are providing? You know, uh, so there is a complementarity there, in the sense that more qualified nurses, more nurses can actually complement the work that doctors are doing. And beyond that would be the issue of the price of these services. Remember, Trump one, because prices were very high during Trump administration. So you could say that Trump lost his second election in 2020 because of COVID, and Biden lost it because of long COVID, because prices were going up because of lots of other factors, including related to COVID. But he was not able to control it, and so one of the things that Trump has promised is reducing prices, and immigration, immigrants provides a lot of services that can become expensive if they are expelled like that. And the second point that you were talking about, which was part, how do they affect employment opportunities for natives? Thing is that undocumented work in certain sectors where natives don't want to work. Secondly, the unemployment rate in the United States is historically low. It's at a very low level. So, yes, wages will go up, but if wages go up, so will the price of things. It's one study I saw that showed that deportation of 13 million people, who are something like 5% of your workforce, their deportation will give an economic shock which would be bigger than the economic shock from the Great Recession, which is the financial meltdown of 2008. They think that the deportation of such a high level would have that kind of shock on the U.S. economy.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of things to think about here, Dr. Kaushal. I mean, I two things I really enjoyed sort of thinking about listening to you. One, of course, when you're talking about the sanctuary cities, what you call the multiple visions of immigration, which is there in the United States and which the sanctuary cities exemplify. I think that is something which not many outside really know about, where you're actually going out of your way to provide an ID, a driver's license, medical insurance for undocumented migrants. I think that is something amazing. And secondly, I think what you talked about, the economic shock at one level, and of course the inflation which is going to come your way if you're going to take out all these undocumented workers who do work in sectors which are not really the preferred ones for Americans there. I think that is going to be something Trump will have to deal with. One last question before we wrap up. I was just wondering, given all these issues we've talked about, and given the fact that this second Trump administration seems far more determined to push through with this entire agenda, even if only for shock and awe, and not really, go through with every undocumented migrant. Do you see that? Do you see a possibility of, you know? A lot many undocumented migrants getting into this whole self deportation mode to avoid the harassment from ICE, to avoid the uncertainty, living in anticipation of raids at the workplaces. Do you think the self deportation is something which is going to come up as well in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I have used the word self-deportation also, but I think it's a meaningless term. What we really mean is that uh, that some undocumented people, they would simply decide to leave on their own, because they think that the environment is not conducive enough for them to live here or prosper here, because most of them basically come here to change their lives, have some economic prosperity, live in a country which is highly advanced compared to their own country. But if they are not welcome, they might actually decide to leave. At the same time, many people who have a legal permit, legal document now, and if their documents expire, they might actually decide to leave. And then the third thing that can happen, which would also be very injurious to the US economy, is that people decide that, well, US is not uh, the heaven's door that they thought it used to be. So they decide not to come here. So a lot of things can happen that will make the United States not as desirable a country to come to. And that can be the long term consequence of all these policies that we see here, that people may just simply decide not to come here, or uh, the US can avoid that by creating more legal channels, and that would be a good thing for undocumented as well. So Trump has an enormous opportunities to something do something good on immigration. One, he can create legal channels, legal visas for places from places where undocumented are coming. Second, he can do something for the undocumented that have been living here for they came here as kids and they have lived here for decades, and they can't really think of another life anywhere else. So he has an opportunity to do good and forever get the votes of Hispanic people living in this country if he does something to that effect. Will he do it? I don't know, but I think it is an opportunity, and he does have the congressional support to do it.
Right. He has also maintained that he's not against legal immigration, right? I mean, that's what he's been saying. It is only against illegal or undocumented migrants.
Well, he says lots of things at lots of times, and yeah. And last time, at the end of it, when he wasn't able to successfully do anything for on undocumented, he started tempering with the the H-1B provisions for H-1B visas or for student visas. So that's the real fear, whether he would do the same things. We don't know. He wants to be seen as a bully, and these are some of the tactics that they employ. Uh, we just have to see. And I mean, last time the civil rights community in this country, civil rights organization, they joined together and they were able to push a lot of the executive orders that Trump had announced. I hope the civil rights organization remain that strong this time, but we don't know, because he's now trying. The Trump administration have come much more prepared, and now they are attacking the sources of revenue for those organizations.
Right. I mean, there's no doubt, of course, as you said, Trump has a great opportunity to open up or expand legal channels for migrants, especially those coming from countries which have been like predominant sources of inward migration. But it remains to be seen to what extent this shock and awe strategy of his on this particular issue continues. That's all I have for you, Dr. Kaushal, this time. Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you on this issue. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.